Good morning, everyone. This is, I'm going to try and minimize the size of the people over. I'm going to delete for now so we can see the entire screen. This is the first talk of the autumn Plato series on pathways to a sustainable planet. I've chosen a book called Climate Gamble. It's written by two Finnish writers, Rauli Partanen, who has a bachelor's degree in business, and Janne Korhonen, who has a master's in engineering. Their subtitle is Anti-Nuclear Activism Endangering Our Future? I think it's a very legitimate question to ask today, and I'll elaborate on that as I go through the book. This is a fairly small book of 100 pages. These authors wrote this book in 2015. They wrote a follow-up book called The Dark Horse. I'll show you a picture of that later. It's 3 times larger, or number of pages. It's called Nuclear Power and Climate Change. So they focus a little bit more on the broader aspects, which we'll be also dealing with when we discuss Bill Gates' book in November. I found it this smaller version an easier one to review. It's just full of little pearls that I'm delighted to share with you. So let me start with the first slide. So before I even get to the first slide, let me mention this cover. It's an artistically, we have to give artistic license, let's say, to Katrina, also from Finland. It looks like the cooling tower on the left is ready to fall into a body of water during a bad rainstorm. And I'm not sure why she did it that way, but it's not very realistic. Cooling towers are common with some, but not all. The vast majority of nuclear reactors have cooling towers. None of them are located anywhere nearly this close to water. Probably the closest proximity to water is in Diablo Canyon, California. And even there, it's well set back on fairly high cliffs. But there is no radioactive material in these towers. They're simply there for cooling purpose because there's so much heat available to convert into energy from a fission reaction. I should mention, by the way, before going on in the talk, that I have a website called rethinkingnuclear.org. All one word, Rethinking Nuclear. We have an action group within that website called Friends of Fission. And the logic of that is that the word nuclear has gained such a negative reputation with regard to weaponry and politics that we decided we would choose the word fission, distinguish it immediately from fusion, and add that information on the website. So if you are looking in the website, look up Friends of Fission in the upper left, and you can explore that action group. So I should also mention that Margie Kindig, who I hope is in the audience, is a good friend of mine and helped me build, or she actually did most of the work in building the Rethinking Nuclear website. And this was one of her favorite books. She used to buy boxes of these books and dispense them to politicians and other people she felt were important to learn quickly about nuclear energy or fission energy. And I learned to appreciate the book through talking with her about it. I glanced at the book and read parts of it, but never read it thoroughly until this year, even though it's 5 years out of date. Now it still has a lot of powerful messages. I'm trying to figure out how to advance. There we are. Okay, the first slide just reveals through the contents, which are basically 4 broad headings. There's the introduction, and that deals with our response to climate change so far over the last 10 to 20 years. And needless to say, it hasn't been a very dramatic response. In fact, practically nil. All we do is talk and argue about it, but we've accomplished very little in terms of reducing our carbon footprint. The second section is called the largest gamble, and that is using up all our fossil fuels, and not only using them up as a resource because we need them for plastics and other things, cosmetics and other important things in our environment, which don't involve burning it up and releasing a lot of CO2. But it's obviously we have to cut way back on them long before we run out of them. The third point they make is understanding the difference between the ultimate goal, halting climate change, versus the tools used to get there. I remember a speaker who came here to Madison a few years ago and pointed out that he'd been to the major meeting in Paris, and the emblem at the conclusion of the symposium and meeting was a renewable sign. And he felt that they were missing the point, that they should have had, and I think it's a very good point, that they were missing the goal and focusing too much on one of the tools. What this book is all about is overdoing certain tools and trying to exclude others that are important. And finally, the last of the talk is, what can we still do? Are environmental organizations part of the problem or part of the solution? I put in this cartoon on my own next to the word nuclear because I found it quite amusing. It shows a fuel energy density graph in megajoules per kilogram. Megajoule is a lot of energy. And you can see that sugar, coal, fat, and gasoline have a pretty impressive fuel energy density, but they're minute compared to uranium. And there's a little stick man there watching this great pile of paper because it ran off the graph, and it's collected over there on the side, and it ends up with 76 million. I checked that number, and it is correct. So there's a huge difference, a millionfold or more, greater difference in energy density with the fission of uranium compared to these other sources of energy varying from sugar to gasoline. The joke at the bottom is kind of cute. They say log scales are for quitters who can't find enough paper to make their point properly. I'm guilty of that. I tend to prefer log scales. So I found that quite amusing. In their introduction, these authors from Finland have picked on Ontario as is an interesting force within the country of Canada. You can see on the upper right, Ontario is highlighted in red. It's a big country. Quebec, to its right, mostly uses hydro, and elsewhere, mostly, also British Columbia on the west coast uses mostly hydro, and the rest of the provinces use a great deal of fossil fuels. So Ontario stands out as a unique province. It's been powered when I was a kid. I used to live in London. I'll point out where London is. It's just about halfway between Toronto and Windsor, Detroit. So right about there. And we used to get all our energy when I was a kid from the Niagara Falls, a lovely run of the river, a source of energy, which with big plants on both the Canadian and American sides that provide power all the way down to New York and across to Toronto and most of southern Ontario. And since then, of course, by 2003, as you see on the upper left, a quarter of Ontario's electricity came from burning coal. Amazing. And they had planned to get rid of the coal, and they were able to do so a year ahead of schedule by 2014. And this success, of course, came not only from having some background hydroelectric energy, but largely because they built several nuclear plants, some of them on Lake Ontario near Toronto and others near Port Elgin. You can see on Lake Huron there, just near the what's called the Bruce Peninsula that divides Georgian Bay here from Lake Huron. So these have made a huge difference. And they point out, as I've highlighted in yellow, and yet no environmental groups acknowledge this dramatic accomplishment of one of the provinces of Canada. They say trying to fight climate change with renewables and energy conservation alone seems like a foolhardy gamble. That was the final note of the introduction, and I think a very fitting one to deal with the word gamble and the fact that it is foolhardy to think we can do this all with renewables and conserving energy. And that will be the main thrust of our talks as I go through this. These images, by the way, that are in color, I have added to fit in with the text. The text is usually lifted word for word, some of the gems that they write. So we'll go to the first statement where they're concerned about failing to meet our energy targets. They say there's a real danger that we will burn all the remaining fossil fuel reserves. And if we burn more than a third of those reserves, we may lock our planet on a path to catastrophic climate change, possibly destroying modern civilization, humanity itself, and most of the planet's current ecosystems. That sounds pretty dramatic, but they're not the only people who say that, and I tend to feel it's a reasonable statement if we don't get serious about the controlling our carbon emissions. The last sentence, cleaning up our energy production might be humanity's defining question for the century. I would have used a word, a different word than defining, since they have might be as the conditional verb. I would have said achieving. But in any case, it's a very good point. The figures above show historically over the last 150 years how we've depended on coal, and the coal has mostly been replaced by other fossil fuels that were discovered in the early 20th century, oil and gas. Along came hydro in the 1920s, mostly from Niagara Falls, and then from Quebec, and then nuclear in the 70s. And that's quite a story about nuclear in Canada. We'll hear more about that from Neil Alexander later this fall. But you can see that we're still using a remarkable amount of coal. This is a global energy and percentage-wise here. So coal has mostly been replaced only by other fossil fuels that are not quite as bad, but almost in terms of carbon emissions. And gas we think of as pretty harmless, at least some of the public do, but methane makes up the vast majority of the so-called natural gas, and it is about 35 times more climate changing as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide is. It doesn't hang around for centuries, only decades, but it's still, for the immediate future, a big problem. And it not only leaks from the well heads, but now that we've developed fracking, it leaks all over the place wherever the gases from fracking manage to seep out. So methane is much more of a problem than we thought. Also looking over here at the right, the exajoules, a very large amount of energy. Exa stands for 10 to the 18th power. And so these are numbers of exajoules from 10 years ago to 2 years ago, 12 years ago, I should say, to 2 years ago. And you can see that we're consuming just as much fossil fuels as we did in the past. The modern renewables, they're thinking of probably not hydro here, but since they use the word modern, they're probably thinking of, this is global again, wind and solar. And the others that are in gray here are probably hydro and nuclear. So they've dropped down a little bit, been taking out some dams, taking out a few nuclear plants, and just changing that with some wind and solar. But really, it's window dressing, basically, is all you can call it, I think, at this point. We need everything we can to quit fossil fuels is another subchapter. And they emphasize that the public is combining the word nuclear with CCS. We talked about CCS before. It stands for carbon capture and sequestration. talk about that more in further slides. But the public seems to, particularly the green people, seem to put that in one camp and renewables and conservation in the other, as though the Greens want to select a pair of tools, renewables and conservation, and neglect nuclear and carbon capture. And the emphasis of these authors is that we need all of them. Although they do say that CCS is a broad term, they might be more willing to accept some than others. And I would strongly agree with that statement. It's a potentially dangerous problem if the carbon dioxide should leak out of a buried pool, put us all to sleep for very quietly in the night. We just wouldn't wake up. So, and that's been seen around some volcanoes that have emitted CO2 that have slowly slid down the hill and put all the people in neighboring towns to sleep permanently. There is a term here over in the lower right called, oops, sorry about that, called CCUS. And you'll see that sometimes in the literature. This is a slide from Valerie Gardner, who runs an organization called Nucleation. She's fundraising for advanced nuclear. And she likes to put the U in there, and others do as well. U means utilization. So you'll sometimes see that also in the term CCS. And the idea is to utilize some of the carbon dioxide immediately for making certain plastics, biofuels, various things like that, so that you don't have to store every last bit of it. So they point out two other things here. They say, besides cleaning up electricity and transportation, which are the obvious things we think of right away, we've got a big job, as we'll hear from Bill Gates in November, to reduce fossil use for industry and to stop cutting trees. The last point is that most eco groups oppose both CCS and nuclear. And we lack the time for more experiments. I am amused at their word experiments, because we have been experimenting now for over 20, sometimes some people would say 30 years, since James Hansen brought to our attention in the Senate in 1988 the importance of getting rid of fossil fuels. And we've spent about 30 years running experiments. It's time to stop the experiments and to actually do some things with the breakthroughs that we have. We can, of course, do some experiments, but not those that would jeopardize or waste time. So, elaborating then on this idea of the goal, halting climate change, and the tools, renewables and nuclear, they say it's crucial that we understand the difference between the two. The goal isn't to install solar panels or conserve energy, although these can help us reach that goal. Also, they point out our emphasis on the weakness of renewable energy sources does not mean that we're opposed to these energy sources. In fact, we do support, within environmental limits, all low carbon sources. Renewables will be important. The only question is how important. And they do say this also to everyone. We do oppose touting some energy sources to the exclusion of nuclear power. And then they say, most importantly, and harmful infighting between low carbon supporters. I think both the Greens that are pushing wind solar and some of the nuclear proponents are both guilty of trying to exclude the other, and that will, I think, ultimately fail both groups, because both will be viewed eventually as being crackpot organizations that aren't really going to help us if we continue to just argue amongst ourselves. Coming back to the fact that eco groups have an aversion to CCS and underlying nuclear power, we need to first elaborate a little bit more on what carbon capture and storage means. And here's a nice diagram of it. You see biomass up here where the arrow is, and coal, and that's being consumed in various ways and being passed through a carbon capture and compression plant, where the CO2 is either compressed and liquefied, and then either sent offshore to go through ancient oil deposits or below those. You notice there's several lines of layers here, and the idea is to put them into an emptied out area where there is room to store this material. I'll talk to you later about possibly about a major project that has just happened in Greenland. They, not Greenland, I'm sorry, Iceland. They just built a very large carbon capture and storage facility there. And what's impressive about Iceland is they have a vast amount of geothermal energy, and more than I think than they know what to do with. And so they've powered this carbon capture and storage facility with the geothermal energy, and then they have a lot of basalt. That's basically what Iceland is made of. Very little soil on the top of that basalt, and so it's very easy for them to pump down carbon dioxide, and it will chemically combine with the basalt and form a carbonate with the minerals in the rocks there. And they've done some tests there and elsewhere and shown that it is chemically stable there, not likely to leak out. And so they built a fairly large plant, and they plan to remove some, I think it's 40 tons of carbon dioxide per year. And as we'll learn from Bill Gates in November, we are putting out every year 51 million tons. And billion tons. So putting down 40,000 tons of carbon dioxide a year is 1/1,000,000th of what we're putting out per year as a global human species society. And so it's 1/1,000,000th. And here we are in an ideal island with basalt nearby, lots of geothermal energy. We'd need 1,000,000 plants like that in order to deal with the problem that we have. So it's not, nobody's suggesting that carbon capture and storage is useless because it doesn't remove it all, but it does show the huge scaling up problem that we would have with that idealized situation. Finally, by trying to ban both options, the public would exclude our most effective ways of cutting carbon emissions and leave us with weak tools. And this is an interesting table that I found a little disconcerting, showing views that are very favorable as you go from dark green to very unfavorable as you go to dark magenta. And you'll notice that for the, I'm sorry, some of those things have been a little obstructed, but solar is the most popular here, and coal the least popular, but right next to it is nuclear. So it's discouraging to see how the public has a very negative feeling about nuclear, probably mostly because of its association with war and weaponry and testing and so on. It's become a very negative term and very fearful to the general public. And I think we need to work on overcoming that. This is their first slide. You'll see the slides that these authors have used. They're in black and white in this small 100-page booklet. But it shows that the authors were really shocked to discover that the entire world has made, these are global numbers here, has made no progress at all since 1990. So over 23 years, we see the oil consumption is down a very modest amount. Coal has gone up, gas gone up, hydro about the same, nuclear down a trifle. Biomass has gone up, but still, fortunately, not very large. Wind has gone up, and solar has too. And against this, I've added this, there was room to add this famous curve called the Keeling curve, which shows the amount of carbon dioxide in parts per million present over the last 40 years or so. And the little red line is the monthly mean because of variations over the month. But the black line is the 12-month running mean, and James Hansen advised us back in 1988 not to get above 350 parts per million. And that's why there's an organization around called 350.org, which is trying to get people to stop using fossil fuels. Unfortunately, they're anti-nuclear as an organization, although Bill McKibben, I think the founder, is not anti-nuclear. He doesn't dare mention it or he'll lose a lot of his following. So that's unfortunate. But we've may have had a tiny little plateau there for a few years after 1990, but we immediately resumed our upward course, and now we're up above 410 parts per million. Another sign, not only are we emitting just as much, but the temperature that we associate as being caused by those carbon emissions is following it very closely. And then we can always say, well, we think that as we get more efficient, people will use their appliances more effectively. And there is a paradox called Jevons paradox, and I think it's expressed very well in this cartoon. Two fellows with, I'm not sure their long arms and their chins are being supported, or whether they have beaks. But anyway, they're standing over a balcony looking at this 80 mile per gallon sign and all the cars underneath saying, gee, these new cars are so efficient. Everyone's driving everywhere these days. And there is some truth to that with we've seen that with LED lighting and with more efficient cars. Not all the energy saved is lost, but certainly there is a rebound effect which could limit our optimistic dreams. And these are more optimistic dreams from the IPCC. In yellow there, it's defined as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. You'll see it quite often now in the news. And this is from their assessments 7 years ago in 2014. They made some forecasts shown in solid lines with shading there of the highest estimate and lowest estimate of the world total energy use within at least the most of the countries on the planet that are giving us data, and their highest and lowest estimates, and they're in the roughly in the 500 exajoules per annum category. And then the dashed lines are the most optimistic estimates of renewable energy potential, showing huge differences between even the highest or lowest estimates and the actual consumption. And the points that they make in relation to this figure is that energy demands, claiming that future energy demands will be lower, overlook future energy needs for replacing our renewable equipment every few decades. Also overlooks the energy needs of poorer countries who are already hungry for our way of life. And they asked the question, for how long can renewables keep growing? There are some obvious limits. People forget about the vast numbers of wind turbines that are being taken, cut up into pieces and put into big landfills in Iowa and other states now. They only last about 20 years and they get damaged by the wind and rain, as well as the turbines themselves. So there's a lot of recycling every 20 years. And if we keep spending vast amounts of money to fill pastures on the wind tunnel that extends from Texas up to Iowa, and have to replace those every 20 years, we can always ask ourselves, how long can they keep on growing? And that doesn't even mention the rare earths that are involved in those turbines and the land, as well as the landfills filling up. Also, they found that some research shows that the most effective technology for making zero carbon energy turns out to be nuclear. If you look at this figure, which is pretty impressive, you can see that hydro has been a pretty stable renewable energy for quite some time, since well before the 60s. And this lightly shaded area represents nuclear, where this is a global thing. So France, United States, Russia, China, and India to some degree have all been building nuclear plants and have had a major impact They said that we, as Finns, were told repeatedly that nuclear power played a marginal role in cleaning up our energy mix. And they say this is absolutely not true. Any progress that we made before the turn of the century was done. There are a lot of countries in Europe besides France, both Eastern Europe and Belgium and other countries where they were building nuclear plants. And they feel that the non-governmental organizations withheld crucial information that led to this popular bias. And they're going to elaborate on this in the next few slides. They asked the question, who is at fault for misrepresenting the IPCC? They say this report was exaggerated by 3 environmental organizations claiming falsely that 80% of the world's energy could be produced with renewables. The people who signed this evaluation, which the press picked up because they couldn't bother reading the original IPCC report, were Josh Muth, president of the European Renewable Energy Council, Steve Sayer, secretary of Global Wind Energy Council, and Sven Teske, who is a climate and energy unit of Greenpeace. And so these, they point out these people, and they have the paper. I've just clipped up the pieces of the letter and blown them up so you could read them. But it's very sad that this report was not read carefully and reported on carefully by most of the world press, but distorted as a result of these people misinterpreting the report. They also point out that adding new renewables now could hit unexpected protective obstacles, including mining and expanded transmission. I'll take you through this figure. It's a little tricky. On the left, you see Europe here in the darker shade, and you see that it peaked in about around 2011, and it's been coming down. China peaked about the same time, and it's been coming down and stabilizing somewhat. The rest of the world is in very light gray, and we don't have data to go beyond 2012 in this 2015 book. And I'm afraid I don't have it either, but I don't imagine it's gone much further than it did in Europe and China. And the wind power installations have also peaked for the world in general. So not that they won't come up again, but to think that they can do it all, those 2 sources of energy, is a bit of a dream. They've also put in an interesting graphic way 8,910 wind turbines, roads, and power connections, and they've put them on this figure to scale, where this distance represents 10 kilometers, and they've compared that with a uranium mine, which is in Australia, so they have to ship it here. But then this Onkalo plant and Olkiluoto plant here. This must be probably some refining and enrichment of the uranium, and then the use in the plant. So what they're pointing out is that the carbon footprint of these 3 nuclear reactors, the roads, power connections, the mine, and so on, is much smaller in a footprint than all of the wind turbines that have been that are producing comparable amounts of energy, but with a much larger footprint. Then this is, I think, one of the most damning slides of all. In 2009, the World Wildlife Fund gave industrial countries scorecards based on their success in mitigating climate change. But the wrong countries were getting the best scores. I happen to know who was the head of the World Wildlife Fund at that time. He was a fellow member of the board of directors of the International Crane Foundation who just passed away a month ago. And I'm afraid he may have been partially responsible for this work or oversaw it too lately to notice. But with a pen stroke, the World Wildlife Fund gave an electricity carbon footprint 4 times higher for France and Sweden. The report was then published with Germany getting the best score. The World Wildlife Fund did not consider nuclear power as a policy option, and they gave it a score like that of methane. And that's terrible, but it's not the worst of it. This other organization, apparently the Carbon Dioxide Information Access Center, tried to look at the best 10 years of emission reductions in 4 countries. They picked France, Belgium, Sweden, and Germany. And here you can see that nuclear over the best 10 years for France of nuclear plant building, were able to reduce their emissions 2% per year. In Belgium, they exceeded that 2.7% per year over that 10-year period. And in Sweden, even better still, 3.1% per year. In Germany, all I could manage was 1% per year. They had to ignore this because that was called wallfall, which took place over 5 years as they decommissioned very inefficient coal plants in East Germany. And so that was the reason for their carbon emission reduction there. This would have been more in line with what they accomplished with nuclear, and they're now taking those out. As you probably know, Germany is about to have an election. The Green Party there is very strong, and they will probably work with whoever forms a minority government and continue to press for the continued destruction and decommissioning of the remaining nuclear plants. The median carbon emissions of electricity production can be thought of as a life cycle assessment. You've probably heard of that acronym, LCA, and they've tried to plot them for various sources of energy. You can see coal, of course, is very high here in grams per kilowatt hour of emitted carbon dioxide, gas, biomass, and so on. They come down to nuclear being a very small amount. They make the point that the LCA for nuclear, small as it is, does include the mining, the enrichment, the fuel fabrication, plant construction, and waste management. And they don't say about that for these, but apparently to more greater or lesser degree, some of these did not include that, but we don't know. They do say, though, that figures for wind and solar here do not account for the energy storage needed for their intermittency. So what they're trying to point out is that this difference between 12 and 820 could be even greater. Also, they have biomass here. Doesn't look so good. And we're going to come and talk about biomass pretty shortly. But before we get there, they have one more interesting figure. They have the best increase in electricity generation per capita over a 15-year period here. And Sweden wins the prize for 8.5 megawatt hours of this is per capita over a 15-year period of increase in electricity generation. So this is not to do with carbon emissions here. This has to do with people who say that, well, it might take too long. And we'll look at, compare nuclear with wind and solar. And you can see all the winners in these countries. United Arab Emirates is hatched because they haven't quite finished it. They think it'll be finished either probably, I think it very nearly finished now in 2021, and probably the energy will be going full tilt in 2022. So they had to use a hatching for that one. And they did that also for Finland, their own country, where they got this number 3 here. They have the first 2 that are smaller up in this upper bar, and that was 6.1 megawatt hours. Was their best electricity generation per capita over 15 years. So that was built fairly fast. This has been slowed. And so they separated this one out, but they hatched it because they think that it will come out doing relatively well, but not as well as the other nuclear ones. And those countries, Denmark, Spain, Germany, and Italy, that didn't do so well, only did best with solar simply because they weren't doing much in the way of nuclear. So some damning evidence. One last point here, and that is about Greenpeace. As climate change rose on the list of our most important problems in the 1990s, green groups were not able to shake off their anti-nuclear sentiments from decades before. They said a good example is Greenpeace in Finland. They're, of course, in most countries, but the group in Finland advertised and released, gave press releases, and the anti-nuclear ones outnumbered the anti-fossil ones by 6-fold over a 2-year span that they followed that organization. So they weren't too impressed with Greenpeace. They do some good things in protecting the oceans, as we talked about last spring, but their attitudes about nuclear seem to be hanging off from these sentiments of long ago. Finally, we do come to biomass. They said wood chips now are shipped from America to Germany. Now, America, I mean Brazil, Canada, and the United States. And these three countries are cutting down forests and making these little chips that you see on the right, sort of an interesting pictorial of how nicely they burn. The World Wildlife Fund has the honesty to say that we'd need 250 million more hectares of forest by 2050 in order to keep up this production of biomass, these wood chips. This is a stark contradiction with the popular image of renewable energy, where we have assigned limits, and countries like Germany in particular have said, well, they're committed to having so much renewable, and then they put biomass as renewable because you can grow more trees, and they think it'll be net negative. I'll have a slide on that in a minute. But because they're falling short on wind and solar, they're not doing as well as they had hoped, and they're shutting down nuclear plants and having to build more coal. They're still behind the 8 ball, so they're filling in a lot of their renewable commitments by burning more biomass, and that's really very sad. So here's some comments about biomass. It's said to be carbon neutral, and they say this is a political statement. Achieving carbon neutrality is modifying one's carbon footprint so that CO2 output has a net neutral impact on the environment. That's the ideal. It was a term, biomass, it was the term devised by the IPCC to simplify their complex concepts. And the word was accepted as being within the renewable category, assuming that all carbon emitted from burning would be sequestered as the harvested forests grew back. And they have this very kind statement, very conservative and carefully worded. This feel-good qualifier depends on many things, including how the biomass was grown, how it was shipped, how it was burned, and how the land was used later. The only comment I'll add to that is that in general, biomass burning furnaces that generate electricity generally have fewer monitored and carefully inspected burning plants than coal plants do that have been around much longer. And so there's concern that biomass may be even worse than burning coal. Now, this slide is an unusual one, but it's not part of the book. I found it when studying the Maryland, and this very interesting grid in Maryland. It's called PJM, stands for Pennsylvania, Jersey, I think it's funny, and Maryland. And they have a fairly large grid in the eastern part of the United States. Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Maryland make up a good chunk of the eastern United States. They use that as a baseline, and they talk about the winners here and the losers, although they don't use quite those words. And I'm not going to elaborate on all the comments here, except to point out that Denmark has a high retail price here, 3 times what we do. Let's say this represents United States. I think some places it might be a little more, but that's a remarkable difference, and almost as dirty as ours. Ireland, theirs is even dirtier because they mostly burn a lot of peat, but their retail price is very high. And of course, Germany, we know, is extraordinarily high. These are the winners: Sweden, Ontario, and France. Sweden has the highest non-fossil fuel of 99% because they have hydro as well as nuclear. I think it's kind of ironic that our young lass, Greta Thunberg, she gives real cheeky lectures to her own country people. And I admire her for doing so, and they take it very well. But she's preaching to the cleanest country on the planet from this point of view. Sort of ironic. I've sent her several emails, as much as I could try and get through on Facebook, and suggest that in addition to looking at carbon capture plants, that she look at nuclear plants in her own country. There are 3 of them that are doing very well there and have been for quite a while. I have a feeling strong feeling that she's anti-nuclear by ignorance, and I would like to try and educate her in some way if I ever could. Anyway, Ontario and France here are doing very well. France has the most nuclear at 72%. Unfortunately, the people, they say, and these are people who are stirred by the Green Party, want more power and less nuclear. So the operator, and I think by that they mean the premier, wants to, may need to add natural gas, and that would be a tragedy. They wanted him to cut back nuclear, the Green Party did, to 50% from 72%. And he initially agreed, but then later said no, fortunately. So hopefully France will stay clean. They have an electrical rail system, and so people can travel very efficiently on these rapid transit trains that are powered mostly with nuclear energy. So it's they're way ahead of us, and most of Europe is, but France especially so. And long may they excel, and may Germany next door learn from them someday. Now, then we have this idea of merchants of doubt. Naomi Oreskes wrote quite an interesting book as a science historian about methods of creating confusion among the public about scientific consensus. All too often, the anti-nuclear movement resorts to similar tactics of spreading fear, uncertainty, and doubt. So I got online and started looking at some of the things she's been saying. And she's not as bad as Greenpeace, but she is generally anti-nuclear in her thinking. And I think it's highly ironic that here is a woman writing about merchants of doubt, and she is spreading doubt and questionable facts about all that waste and so on, just like Bernie Sanders, without educating herself. So I'm not sure if I'll be able to get through to her or not, but if I am able to, I shall. Now, how dangerous is radiation actually? Well, we've talked about this at length last spring, and so I only put in one very simplified figure to amplify what these authors say. They say we know that very high doses of radiation are harmful, obviously, but chronic low dose exposure is part of our environment. Not only that, but the basic assumptions made by the linear no threshold hypothesis decades ago were based on high dose short term radiation, not on chronic low dose exposure, which is quite different biologically. What I like about the figure here is, which amplifies on our planet's bedrock containing radioactive elements, is that these natural sources are coming from food. You remember that we talk about the banana equivalent dose in millisieverts, how much we take in a year. And this is a world average. Cosmic rays, soil, and radon. We talked about that at length. But look, compared to these natural sources, which we're all exposed to, and then compare it with the artificial sources. And these are much smaller. And the radiology is by far the largest because taking X-rays has become a very essential part of our health. Chest X-rays, mammograms have helped to reduce cancer mortality. And of course, CAT scans are a fairly big source of exposure to radiation. And it's interesting, as a radiation oncologist, I found that none of the patients who came to see me from my surgical colleagues had any fear of the radiation at all. When they compared long-term radiation effects with the immediate threat of cancer, it really changed their perspective. I had to talk some patients out of radiation therapy. I remember a woman came to me with pregnant, with about 6 months pregnant, and she'd had a lumpectomy, and she wanted me to irradiate her breast, and so that she would not have to have a mastectomy. And I said, no, I'm afraid I'm not willing to do that. We then made some careful measurements. We looked at calculated the amount of exposure that her fetus would get from X-ray scattering. Even though we would aim our beams very carefully to the breast only, there was sufficient scatter that I was afraid her fetus might develop leukemia in the decades that would follow. And so I suggested that she continue with her pregnancy, and I would irradiate her breast afterwards. And she consented to that. Fortunately, it was a very low-grade cancer. and it did not threaten her life unduly. And so she breastfed her child with the non-irradiated breast. And that was 30 years ago. To the best of my knowledge, she and her child, now grown, are doing well. Or I would have heard about it, I'm sure. But anyway, that's an example of how radiotherapy, as well as diagnostic X-rays, have contributed to our artificial sources. These, at least, are very well focused and kept away from the precious, most sensitive tissues like the fetus. Okay, now talking about the relative safety of various energy sources, shown as illnesses in light gray or deaths as in black. And they point out the words of our authors here: fear-mongering was more dangerous than radiation itself. For Germany closed their NPPs, that means nuclear power plants, to build more coal plants. They have a lot of lignite in Germany and even more in Poland. Poland says they have a right to keep burning lignite, even though a lot of their pollution falls over on Germany and France. So I think that's exceptional how countries feel they have certain rights. Notice that the values for nuclear are too small here, 0.22 and 0.07, to even show up on the graph. And that is the record. I believe it includes both Chernobyl and well, Chernobyl is the only one really that we're aware of that has caused any deaths at all. Fukushima may have caused a thyroid cancer that I think has been cured. So we don't have any clear-cut evidence of deaths from Fukushima, and certainly none from 3 Mile Island. So people need to look at the perspective. I think they're bothered by the inconvenience of having to move as they had to in Japan, and that was wildly exaggerated by the authorities and caused a lot of needless suicide. But anyway, that's a difference very clearly shown and a very good track record. What about this business of anti-nuclear reports of dangers from nuclear waste disposal? I'll get into the waste in some detail in a few minutes, but before I go to that, let me show you this figure that from their book. It shows 10 years after the Fukushima accident, the media complained about diluting 40 trillion becquerels of tritium into the Pacific Ocean. Well, you have to take that 40 trillion becquerels. A becquerel is a tiny, tiny amount of radioactivity equivalent to 1 disintegration per second. Tritium has a short half-life of about 14 years. So it's 10 years now after the event. It's almost down to half its initial activity. And when diluted by the Pacific Ocean, the amount of exposure that anybody could get would be equivalent to 44 self-luminescent exit signs. So how serious is this waste problem? I'm going to get into this in a little detail here. Nuclear power, they point out, is the only major energy industry to collect and store all of its waste. In spite of political maneuvering about building deep underground storage facilities, several viable options have been well studied. And they say that in Finland, I think it's the only country to get serious about building nuclear repositories. And they say in their last point, this is word for word, all these quotes that I'm giving you: anyone arguing against nuclear energy by saying that safety guarantees are impossible is subscribing to a magical or homeopathic view of radiation. And these are some things that I pulled off the web about their disposal project near Onkalo, Finland. The radioactive elements are separated from the environment. They're enclosed in these copper canisters, and then which in turn are surrounded by bentonite clay. So this would be a view down the tubes, and this would be a diagrammatic idea of the repositories on the surface with these various pathways down to the various levels where these copper tubes would be inserted. And all of this is bentonite clay around it, very photon absorbing material. They say that we know about waste repositories. in geologic timescales. It's not waste, nuclear waste isn't new. They've found now 15 nuclear reactors that were discovered in Gabon, Africa, about 50 years ago. These reactors are natural ones. They were born about 2 billion years ago when the groundwater began to seep through rich uranium deposits. Back in those days, the uranium was much more uranium-235 than 238, so the chain reactions were spontaneous as the water came down and moderated the reactions so that you could actually have neutron to neutron interactions leading to a continuous chain event. And these went on for about 500,000 years, and the reactions were the same then as they are now artificially. So it's not the uranium that we find in the mines where we go mining today are not reacting because the amount of fissionable uranium, the isotope 235, has now decayed so far after the planet was formed that we don't have spontaneous chain reactions, but the deposits nonetheless are there and they've just petered out. Now, there are still rich deposits of uranium. I say rich in terms of the concentration, not in terms of the amount of isotope, which is much lower now, less than 1/10 of 1%. But these deposits have been discovered in Canada, Scotland, and Italy, and they're natural analogies to the nuclear waste disposal today, but we would look after it much more if we'd only get rid of the politics and open Yucca Mountain as it's been already built and it's just sitting there doing nothing now for purely political reasons. We've also ignored toxic heavy metals associated with solar panels, cadmium there, as well as mercury in the coal. And yet they stay dangerous, they don't degrade with time, and yet they're simply buried in local landfill. So our use of logic in being hyper concerned about all that waste and its burial is totally out of line with reality. This is the most important slide, I think, of the whole series. This is coming from their follow-up book called The Dark Horse. It's a rather bizarre cover, but perhaps a little more accurate than the artistic one on this book. This is a 300-page book, not 100-page. And I'll just lift these comments, slightly edited, but not very much. They say the spent nuclear fuel, the media calls it waste, will soon become a useful, valuable source of fuel for advanced reactors. We did talk about that a good bit last spring. Fission products are high-level nuclear waste, but there will be less of it, which will lose its radioactivity much faster than the original nuclides. And I'll elaborate on that in the next slide. The staggering amount of clean energy available through thorium-fueled breeder reactors is real. Combined with seawater extraction, we can actually get thorium from the ocean water. Our nuclear fuel supply is basically limitless, and yet nobody would dare call it renewable, but I think limitless is a better word. Anyway, this is from that book. And now I'm going to go into a little bit of time. We're 11 o'clock and I'm almost finished. There are 3 types of material in our spent fuel. Notice I use the word spent fuel, not waste. The first is slowly decaying material, and that's mostly the fuel itself that has not been used because we only use about 2% of it. It's mostly uranium, and we do build up slowly some plutonium within those reactors. Their half-lives, both uranium and the plutonium, are in thousands or millions of years, and they do make up 95% of it. There's no denying that is a problem at the moment. Then there are the quickly decaying materials, such as iodine-131, that has a half-life of hours or days. They're dangerous, but they will disappear very soon. And then there are the fission products. These are isotopes with intermediate half-lives in decades, like strontium-90 and cesium-137. I'll have a slide for that next. The point is that the fast neutron breeder reactors can burn or transmute most of group 1, which is the really big problem. So if you're burning up in these advanced reactors that we talked about last spring, 98% of the fuel instead of only 2%, you really get rid, it's already rid of a vast amount of so-called waste. As you may recall, people say that an individual's energy, if it all came from nuclear, all the waste from that energy over an individual's lifetime would fit in a Coke can. And that's at the present time. If we switched to advanced reactors, which I think we'll be able to do in a few decades or a decade or maybe even less, 95% of that will be gone. So we'll only have the parts 2 and 3 that I showed you here. The quickly decaying materials, which will be decayed, and these fission products. And here is the key about the fission products. The half-life of cesium is 30 years. Well, that's cesium there. Well, that for strontium is 28.8 years, very similar to it. So all you have to do really is store these fission products for 300 years, not tens of thousands or millions, but only 300 years, and you will be down 10 half-lives, and you will have a tenth of 1% of these elements left. And so this is the key to understanding and appreciating that the problem of waste is solvable, imminently solvable within a decade as we gradually switch from our generation 2 reactors to generation 4. Finally, is nuclear power cheap or expensive? That is always a problem, and people constantly use the rhetoric, we can't afford nuclear power. And the cost of the power is often distorted by focusing on the installed capacity. And so they compare it with the installed capacity of vast fields of solar panels and areas of wind turbines instead of the energy produced. Now, the energy produced is an interesting thing to focus on, and it's done most readily by looking at what's called the capacity factor. And these are world average capacity factors that you see on this figure taken from their book. It has major implications on the prices of the energy type being produced. The capacity factor is basically the percentage of time that the installed source of energy is actually producing its installed level. So if you take hydroelectric, because of the low levels of reservoirs, we're generally only harvesting 40 to 50% of the potential installed capacity behind that hydro dam. With wind, it's 20 to 40%. With solar and concentrated solar power, that is these special systems that you've seen about in California, where you have mirrors reflecting it and concentrating the energy to a point, that can be 30 to 40%. The typical solar photovoltaic is 10 to 20%. Coal at the top is 50 to 70%. Nuclear is 80 to 90%. And this has been consistent, especially in the last 20 years, as we've gotten the recharge refueling time of nuclear plants from reactors, I should say, from about 3 months down to about 6 weeks, about half of that. And that's cut significantly. The 80 is much closer to 90 on today's numbers. And this is not from the book at all, but it's from a website that I highly recommend that you look at. It's called Thoughtscapism. A woman by the name of Rauli, who's a Finnish biologist now living in Switzerland, has a remarkable website that deals with a lot of aspects of biology, and she is very knowledgeable about nuclear energy as well as wind. And she's made this remarkable table that is on the Rethinking Nuclear website. Let me take it through for you. They've compared Korea, which is very effective at keeping their costs down, and that's the initial capital investment in euros per gigawatt of electricity. Finland was nearly as good, but the onshore wind, in Europe averaged 1.6 more, in keeping with the nuclear plant in Korea. But then you look at the capacity factor. She's picked 90%, which is a more realistic figure than I showed you in the last slide, 80 to 90. And this is about 25%, pretty liberal for onshore wind. The lifetime used, this is pretty conservative. Plants are routinely lasting for 60 years. Some of them are getting renewed for 80 with the possibility in many people's minds of going for 100. Onshore wind is good to last 20. And when you factor in all those things, the capacity factor in the lifetime, and multiply them all out, you end up with 0.4 cents, less than half a cent per kilowatt hour in Korea, just a little over a cent in Finland, and almost 4 cents for wind. So the idea of the cost of nuclear, I think, can get exaggerated by looking at just these initial numbers rather than taking into account the capacity factor and the lifetime. They talked about costs here, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide. It's rather complicated. They talk in these various shades, and it's hard to see when in black and white. But the first thing they deal with coal, for example, is climate change and the extra costs that they have to take into account in dealing with that. And that's factored in. The light gray is particulate matter formations and other, I'm not quite sure what that is. Nuclear accidents, of course, only applies the very dark black for nuclear in these two spots. And then depletion of energy resources is a concern here. So you see they've given a high estimate for nuclear and a low estimate depending upon which ones you're most concerned about. I think this difference here is they're worried about wastes here. And so they're more worried about depletion, maybe of energy resources. I'm not sure how they come up with those two. They point out that the main issue with fossil fuels and biomass is that they externalize their costs. Small particulates from them cause premature deaths, and that's for sure. The nuclear industry has internalized a large part of its cost by collecting waste. So they come to the final question in the last part of their book. Are environmental organizations part of the problem? We've already seen some points about errors made that they are part of the problem. The authors note that the anti-nuclear heritage of environmental organizations from the 70s, they say very conservatively and gently, oh yeah, they could have a net negative effect on climate change mitigation. And then in brackets, they say, this is counterproductive since the energy densities of nuclear versus renewable differ by, this is my addition, by over 10 billion. The log man again here talking. This will lead to burning more fossil fuels and biomass, a serious error. They point out that a recent positive sign is the publication of this is online. You can download this onto your computer. It's 30 pages long from the Eco-Modernist Manifesto. And you can Google this, read through it, and they feel that that's a beneficial thing. I've read it, but it's been some time. I haven't read it recently. It seems fine to me. But I have not planned to give a talk about it. And what can we still do? One of the second last questions they ask. Well, we all need to strongly promote all forms of clean energy. Stopping climate change is not as easy as many organizations seem to believe. And we're going to hear about this in November from Bill Gates. He makes that very clear. Perhaps they don't understand the scale of the problem. Everyone should try to be an environmentalist. But we need to try and do it the right way. So rethink your prejudices and priorities. Pro-nuclear and pro-renewable people should join forces, here, to tackle the climate problem. We're not asking people to stop voicing their opinions. We ask for a prudent use of limited resources. How well put. What can you do? Well, you can keep your aim on the goal, halting emissions, and stop focusing so much on the tools, maybe in the argument between renewables and nuclear. We can share this idea with friends and family, ask hard questions about new tools. Don't limit your options arbitrarily and include nuclear power. It is essential, they say, for mitigating climate change. I couldn't resist putting this cartoon in. It came across my desk a few weeks ago. You see the four horses of the apocalypse: war, famine, pestilence, and death. And the guy Death riding on the last horse sees a newcomer, and he says, "And you are?" And the newcomer says, "Misinformation." Boy, we see that with COVID as well as nuclear. So here is their last paragraph, and you see pictures of these two Finnish scholars. They say, the evidence so far suggests that nuclear power is one of the most essential tools we have to mitigate climate change. We do not have the luxury of picking favorites. We cannot afford to take more time before taking action. We need everything we have, including older nuclear reactors and the new advanced ones. So that is it. I have a couple of reserve slides if we get into such issues in the discussion period, but I'd like to just close it there. It's now 12 after 11 and open it up for questions. So let me do that. And open up the gallery and let anybody who's raising their hand be opened up their mics or unmic themselves. Doug Edwards has a question. He says, my understanding is that most use of CO2 from carbon capture and sequestration projects is for advanced recovery of fossil fuels. I think you're right, Doug. That's unfortunate, but I haven't mentioned that, but it's very true, at least so far. The Greens say, good summary, Richard. Thank you, the Greens. Tony, do you have a comment you'd like to make? I see your name there. I'm glad to have you. And please unmute and let us know if you have any thoughts.
Richard?
Yes.
Unfortunately, I had you unmuted.
Yeah, I unmuted you.
Okay, very good.
That's Tony. Yeah, very good. Go ahead, Tony.
So at this point in time, a very good presentation, of course. Like the way you covered all the key factors associated with that book that you read. As you touched on waste, it's definitely, as I look at the presentation I'm doing on October 11th, which is focused on recycling. Waste is a key factor associated with recycling. And so I'll pick up a couple of things that I got out of your presentation, and I've got a lot that I've already created associated with it. And I'm going to try and touch on all the key areas and then focus in on one key specific in regards to recycling. And I'll hold that as a caveat to the future as far as when I do the presentation. So
that's good. I want to thank you publicly, Tony. You've been a great asset and assistant over the years, and I'm glad that your health is returning in your occupations with the very many voluntary organizations that you've been involved with has been wonderful. And you and I have talked a little bit about the field trip, and we both regret very much not being able to do the field trip again this year because of the resurgence of COVID. But I really do appreciate your coming up with a very appropriate talk on October the 11th. So we can pretend we're on a field trip, but listen to Tony talk about recycling that day. So thank you, Tony.
thank you.
Any others would like to say a word? Got a good turnout here.
Richard, can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you, Doctor. Very well. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Mine is a very naive question. There's an article in the paper this morning about decommissioning various nuclear plants in Wisconsin. And I didn't really understand it. It was like various corporations coming in to decommission nuclear plants at a profit for them.
Yes.
Could you clarify what that all means? Thank you.
Well, I'll do my best. There are two nuclear plants that have been active in the relatively recent past along the northern part of Wisconsin, along the shore of Lake Michigan. And one of them is called Kewanee, and that has been owned, I believe, by a company that decided that it couldn't compete with natural gas. And so it was decommissioned about 5 years ago, I believe. Now, to say that it was set up for decommissioning doesn't mean that it is yet decommissioned. These decommissioning processes take sometimes more than 10 years, sometimes 15 or 20, because if they hold them, if the company that buys them from a utility, they can often benefit from investing the money that's already been pooled there for the decommissioning process. And they will sometimes do that just to enjoy that payoff. And then they will eventually have interest. And then they will eventually go through the principal, and sometimes they will take their time about it. There is a company which, there are quite a few companies that do this, but there's one in particular that interests me called Holtec, Holtec. And I'm not sure if Holtec is involved in this. Sometimes they change hands while they're in the decommissioning process. But I'm quite interested in Holtec because it's the only one of several decommissioning plants that are building advanced reactors that could be plugged into cut back perhaps on the total output, but make it easier to install and compete with the prices of natural gas and avoid a complete shutdown. Might be reduced in amount, but it would perhaps be more efficient and as I say, avoid the shutdown. Utilize the wiring and the transmission that's already in place. And sometimes those plants have been inspected relatively recently or in reasonably good shape. So that's my comment on Kewaunee. The other one is called Point Beach, I believe, and that is north of Kewaunee. And to the best of my knowledge, it's still very operational, and I've not heard of anything about its decommissioning. And I doubt, unless there's something quite sudden has happened, I doubt that that is being discussed in the article. If they said in plural in the article, then that worries me because it would imply that both plants are scaled to be decommissioned. I've talked with a nuclear supportive attorney here in town, and he's assured me that Point Beach is quite stable. But thanks for telling me about the article. I will look into it and see if I can come up with any updates. And if you do so, please let us know at our next meeting. But
Richard, I believe Lewis had their hand up.
Yes, Lewis, go ahead.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted. Good job, Richard. I caught a lot of details, especially the efficiency of nuclear over time, all that, and made a great impact. But just a couple things with solar and wind. I mean, and you've heard me say this before. Two things: baseload power and distance losses. And renewables can't deal with either of those. I mean, baseload is needed to counteract the intermittency of wind and solar. To some degree, those two things counter intermittency between them here and there, but not nearly enough. And without baseload power, you can't, people are just going to have brownouts and rolling blackouts and all this or whatever. And you can't move that energy very far. I mean, you move it more than what, 400 or 500 miles and you're losing too much. So how do these organizations explain those deficiencies in renewables?
Thank you for the good question. I think your points are well taken. By the way, I should tell the audience that Lou is working with me on the Friends of Fishing Action Group within Rethinking Nuclear. He has, I believe, 28 years of experience as an educator within the Argonne National Laboratory. So I appreciate your thoughts, Lou, and I completely agree on both of your points. I think that it's very essential that if these plants in Wisconsin or elsewhere are shut down, if we look at the past, if we look at what happened in California, New York, and so on, whenever nuclear plants were shut down, they did not replace them with coal plants, fortunately, but they replaced them with natural gas, which can be built fairly quickly, and a certain amount of wind and solar, but the very slight increase in wind and solar, as you well point out, has to be supported by a baseline source. And people have been using natural gas for that historically, and will continue to do so until these companies like Holtec can get NRC approval, that's National Nuclear Regulatory Commission approval, to install Generation 4 reactors where the old ones are removed. And Holtec has a license for decommissioning, and I'm hoping that they'll get approval for installing their Gen 4 reactors to replace the old aging Gen 2 reactors, which should be able to make a better economic go of it. So that would be one solution. But I completely agree with your reservation. So the question you ask at the end of your question, how did these people get away with making these statements? They simply don't know any better. And I'll give you an example. Some of you have heard me talk of a fellow by the name of Mark Jacobson. He's in the faculty of civil and engineering at Stanford University, and he's written several publications insisting that we can get away with 100% renewable or nearly 100% plus energy conservation. And when he was challenged by some excellent people here in the Midwest and elsewhere around the country in several papers, he sued them. And that made him look pretty bad. And so he finally dropped his lawsuit. But he obviously cannot take criticism very well. And some people have called him his idea a path to nowhere because he was talking about this idea of 100% renewables. I don't know of any country that of any size, you can have a little island, perhaps working with solar and wind in a nice part of the planet, where everybody, perhaps 20 homes or so, understand that at certain times of the day, they just don't bother plugging in. But if you're going to have a country, you could take Denmark, for example. It has no nuclear, but has a lot of wind and some of it offshore. And they have found it very difficult to get beyond 20% of the grid. We talked about this a bit with Meredith Engwin last January, when we had this problem in late February, when we had this problem in Texas. The grid simply won't tolerate it. It's not a storage battery. It's an exchange of electrons, and we treat it like a storage battery, but it simply isn't. And unless you have that base load, you get into serious brownouts and serious problems. So that is a point. While we're on the subject of Denmark, by the way, and since you all undoubtedly have heard about our president being enthused about building offshore wind turbines near Nantucket. It's nice that we're thinking about this sort of thing, but I hope that somebody gives him some advice on the experience of Denmark, because they have published now the fact that the median time until significant replacement of equipment on these turbines is required offshore is 5 years. We're not talking 20 years, 5 years. And that's the median time. It doesn't mean that some of them perhaps are a little shorter, some a bit longer, but it's not a very safe place to be doing turbine repairs in an offshore wind turbine. And so I'm hoping that whatever decisions are made by our politicians, that they someday wake up that there is a word that starts with N that can solve their problems much better than offshore wind. I'm really concerned. It does have the nice idea that it runs a little bit more than 20 or 30% of the time. It might have a higher capacity factor. But if the median time to repair them is only 5 years, that worries me considerably. But Denmark also has big problems trying to exceed 20% of the grid. There are certain days when it goes higher, but that's nobody's gotten anywhere near 100%. I've heard of some places where they've gotten up to 50% for one day. But this is a myth and that you can, the whole idea of Mark Jacobson's roadway or pathway to renewable energy, 100% renewable, is simply a myth.
Just, can I add something, sort of you know, Elon Musk and even one of my Argonne scientists have said, oh, we can power the whole country with solar in an area of 100 miles by 100 mile footprint. And I think that's misleading beyond belief. It's misleading because of something you've just indicated. You can't squeeze all that energy out. It's kind of, and I don't know if intermittency has been built into that 100 by 100, but it gives a false image to people. Yeah. Like, oh, you know, and we can do the whole thing with solar. And then you have the distance losses through high voltage lines that you can't move that energy to the East Coast or the West. If you're putting it in Kansas or Arizona, or, you know, who wants to, you know, that's just, how do you move all that energy out? And it's basically what you just said too. You can't just push it out. There's going to be limits with the lines, period, you know.
Yes. Good. Thank you for that thought, Lou. Mert has a question. Do you know if the new power recovery steam condenser systems applicable to nuclear plants? No, my answer to that, Mert, is no, I don't know. I know that there are some new power recovery steam condenser systems where they've tried to raise the efficiency, and I think that's working fairly well, not only at nuclear plants, but probably at some coal plants where you have a lot of heat, and the recovery has generally been in the neighborhood of 30%, or the efficiency of those plants. And my guess is that they've been raising it to, in some cases, to 50%. I'm not aware of it going any higher than that, but I'm all for it. I think some wonderful things have happened to nuclear that people don't know of. Taking just a little tiny slant of your question, Mert, a lot of people don't know about it. Something I may have mentioned it to this group in the past, but our group is evolving. We have a lot of newcomers on board, and want to make everybody aware of the fact that for about 10 years after the USSR dissolved, they were in really deep financial straits, and some negotiations, very quiet negotiations, were made that the public was not aware of or made aware of. And that was that we would buy nuclear warheads from what turned out to be Russia after the USSR dissolved. We were in really dire straits, and we bought those warheads and diluted that 90% enriched uranium into the mixed oxide fuel, or MOX fuel, that our Generation 2 reactors could consume or burn or fission. And apparently it allowed us to almost stop uranium mining for about 10 years. So we helped Russia, and we fueled a lot of our electricity with Russian warheads, as I understand it, for about 10 years. It's not made very public. It's sort of kept under the shadows. But I think if Eisenhower were around today, where he had his dream of the atoms for peace, he would have been pleased to know that that we helped Russia out, although we're not feeling very friendly with Russia these days. During the days of Gorbachev, we were, and it was nice that we could convert weapons to peaceful atoms for about 10 years. So I just add that comment to yours, Mert, about different forms of energy and making it more efficient, although that doesn't relate so much to steam condensers, but still a bit of a stretch. Any other comments or questions? I think Mike Green, do you have any comments?
Actually, this is Lynn Green, the non-scientist of the family. Mike and I are sharing the screen.
Yes.
As you know, Mike's career was in nuclear physics, so clearly we're on board with the nuclear. But as a non-scientist, I'm going to stick my neck out here and say, I just feel like we have to, although very supportive of nuclear, we also have to be open to, I think, the solar and wind options in terms of at least our discussions. Because I think the common man, who I'm more common than the rest of you on this group, it can buy into solar and wind and can get on board, I think, then with the whole concepts of renewable and climate change and other things. So, I think promoting nuclear is great, but I also think that solar and wind has a place. I mean, I'll give you a really crazy little example, but the only thing that saved our kids during Hurricane Ida in New Orleans is their solar panels that produced enough power during the day for them to recharge their things and keep the refrigerator going. And, so, and I will tell you I'm biased. As you know, Richard, our daughter works for the National Renewable Energy Lab, NREL, and her specialty is offshore wind turbines. And, so I just think, I guess I just wanted to chime in and say, I just think we have to be open to all the alternatives, which I felt your summary made a point of. So that's my only comment.
Thank you, Lynn. I really appreciate that very much. I think you make a very good point that in trying to combat the 100% renewable folk, pro-nuclear people can sound a bit combative. What I do like about this book is that these gentlemen seem to be very fair, and I very much appreciate your endorsement of that idea. I do think we have to work together. I have solar panels on my roof, and I know what they can do all summer long, as well as for several months, what they can't do in the winter. But I am glad that your relatives in Louisiana did better than I could do. Most of us who have solar panels plug into the grid, and when we lose power, we lose the energy from the solar panels. So your relatives down south were wise enough to either not be on the grid or find a way of detaching themselves on the grid without losing the functions of their solar panels. And I think that's great. I have a cardiologist friend who has a lot of solar panels, and he has a garage, two walls of his garage lined with conventional lead acid batteries, which are highly recyclable, in which he makes a point of recycling at appropriate intervals and according to a schedule. And this man called me the day he got off the grid. He was so pleased that he's an independent sort of fellow. And I visited his home several times and observed this nice reserve. It's in Wisconsin, I think it's tricky to do what your relatives down south did. Maybe I'm not aware of other ways to take advantage of the grid without getting shut down when the power fails. But it's a great thing to do if you can do it. This gentleman has a woodlot next to him that he owns of black walnut trees, and some big storms came along and blew down a good percentage of these. And so he has a good chainsaw and some kind of a Franklin stove in his house that can heat up most of the house with that. So he can get along with minimal support from gasoline power generators and function with just the wood for the heat and the solar panels. He had to buy a special refrigerator made in Sweden with very thick walls so that he could keep his refrigerator functioning well year round with his solar panels. And so it can be done. But I think that the most important thing, getting back to the book, is the idea of working together. Sometimes I apologize a little bit if I'm too anti wind and solar. I'm not. I'm anti 100%, or even the idea of 50%, which I think is a bit high. I'm not aware of any country, as I say, for any consistent period of time exceeding 20%. and as a country. So that, and I think that was reaffirmed by Meredith Angwin when she came and spoke last February. If anybody knows of a country existing year-round at a higher percent, I'd be interested in knowing about it. So I think we need to be realistic. Somewhere between 5 and 20% is fine with me. I think over that is perhaps dreaming. And so I think these speakers are trying to get us to be realistic about the percent of wind and solar, but certainly embrace it. And I'm all for that. So I appreciate your comments, Lynn. Any other thoughts, questions? As I say, I have the 3 slides, but I think I might hold them for another time and use them to. One of them does talk about the huge federal credits that are given to wind and solar, many orders of magnitude higher for wind and solar at the present time than for nuclear. And so I'm really pleased that the governor of Illinois, Pritzker, put up some money to help Exelon keep 2 or 3 of their nuclear plants in northern Illinois going. We really needed that. And hopefully those plants can be further modernized or supplemented with Gen 4 reactors or small modular reactors in such a way that they can be kept going beyond any federal support. The price of natural gas has gone up recently. I don't know how. It's a very volatile source of energy. It's hard to say how high it will go, but we do have a problem with natural gas. It's going to be a problem for heating. We had a speaker last spring by the name of Robert Hargraves, a professor from Dartmouth University, and his theme is electrify everything. If you can imagine heating our homes with electricity, which is not the most efficient way to do it, but feasible if we had a good source of electricity like nuclear, that would be wonderful. But as I see it, it's going to be tough to take away the natural gas lines and replace them with just pure electricity. I'd like to see it happen, but until it happens, we're going to be burning and fracking a lot of natural gas. And that's a shame. It's going to get in our way of getting rid of our carbon emissions. But that's another whole story that we can talk about later. Let me take the last couple of minutes to mention our next speaker. Her name is Dr. Marcia. I don't have a book right here, so I thought I did, but anyway, Dr. Marcia Bjornerud from Lawrence University, and her title is Timefulness. I don't have the book here because I was reading it last night in a different part of the house, but I think she is a geologist who's remarkable in her giving us a sense of time and geologic time, and allowing us to appreciate the evolution of the planet and appreciate just how precious it is, and the future perhaps of the planet as we continue to burn fossil fuels. I don't know if she's going to touch on that or not, but I'm finding her book quite enjoyable, and I'm delighted that she's willing to give us a summary of the book next week on October the 4th. So I encourage you all to join in then, and I'm really looking forward to her talk. So thanks all for being here, and I look forward to seeing you, and perhaps more even, next week.
Thank you, Richard. Good presentation.
You're very welcome. I've enjoyed giving it. You're a great audience, and I appreciate your feedback. Bye-bye now.
Bye.